Hello again, everybody. It's good to be with you again as we continue our study in evidences for our faith, particularly creation versus evolution. We are continuing our study in lesson 11. As we mentioned Wednesday night, we are going a little bit out of my previous order. We are jumping on into lesson 11 in our book. As you know, the book we're studying is Unraveling Evolution by Joshua Gertler. We're going into lesson 11 in that book tonight, and then we'll go into lesson 12, and then we'll back up to lesson 10. And get into lesson 10, that will be the lesson on punctuated equilibria. And then back up even further, going back to lessons 4 and 5, and study about theistic evolution. So just a reminder of where we are and where we're going next. So we're going into study of the flood, and since we've been talking about fossils, it's a real good transition, I think, to just go in and talk about what caused all the fossils to be where they are and how they are, so that we can dig them up and examine them. And so we're looking at catastrophism and the flood tonight. Then after we do the theistic evolution classes in lessons 4 and 5, then we'll look for about 4 lessons on the ultimate proof of creation. And I'm really looking forward to that, as I've told you before. So let's get right into our lesson. Tonight we are studying on the difference between uniformitarianism and catastrophism. Those are big words, but just to explain what they mean, let's talk first of all about uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is that doctrine says that natural processes have always continued, just as they do now, have always continued at the current rates. And their little mantra is the present is the key to the past. So in other words, whatever you see now is the way it's always been. And there's been no differences in not only the processes, but how fast they go. The current rates are the way that they've always been. Now let's make a distinction between uniformitarianism and uniformity. Even though those words sound somewhat alike, they are very different. Uniformitarianism says that there's been no change in the rates throughout history, but uniformity says that yes, the processes remain the same, but at different rates. Things change depending on what is going on the earth. God can make different changes, and he has done that with creation and with the fall of mankind and with, of course, the biblical flood. Those rates have changed, but the processes remain the same. And we're going to be talking about uniformitarianism tonight, but in a future lesson, we'll talk more about uniformity. Uniformity is true, but uniformitarianism, I believe, is false. So we'll be able to see more about the differences between those two as we go forward. But the one thing you need to know about uniformitarianism is that it denies a supernatural creation. It denies that there is a God, and denies that God created the universe, and that he controls everything. And it also denies, very importantly, the biblical flood. So they say that everything you see on the earth, the same things we study to prove the flood, they say proves just the opposite, that there was no such thing as a flood. But uniformitarianism, everything continues just the way it always has. But the Apostle Peter, as we mentioned in a previous lesson, described this philosophy of uniformitarianism when he said in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 6, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby, that is, by the word of God, the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So Peter here is describing the flood, and is saying that people just went along, and they say, they just are going along and saying, there's no difference. Everything continues just the way it always had. And they deny that the flood ever happened. Peter wrote that in the 1st century, and here we are, the 21st century, and people are still saying the same thing that Peter wrote against, that people were saying at that time. Isn't that amazing? But when we talk about the flood and fossils, we have to talk about sedimentary rock. Talked about that in previous lessons. But according to evolutionists, according to uniformitarianists, how do you say that? Uniformitarianismists, they say that sedimentation rates, in other words, you can study sedimentary rock and know how long it took to lay that down, for nature to lay down that sedimentary rock. But it varies widely depending on who you listen to. Schuchert said in 1931 that for every foot, that is every 12 inches of sedimentary rock, that represents 3,000 years. But Officer in 1996 said, notice here it is 65 years later, he said, no, 1 foot equals 30,000 years. In other words, we need more time in order to make evolution feasible. So at least that's what I suspect was the reason for the increase in time. But so depending on who you listen to, those sedimentary rock layers were laid down very slowly, anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000 years per foot of thickness of sedimentary rock. But here is a quote from the Principles of Stratigraphy. Now, stratigraphy is the study of strata. Remember what strata are? A stratum is a layer. And so those who study stratigraphy are studying the layers that are laid down by sediment, by water in sedimentary rock. So according to the book's Principles of Stratigraphy, to some thoughtful stratigraphers, this amazing discovery, the fact that things took billions of years to be laid down, that fact presented a dilemma. For if the known stratified rocks have been accumulating throughout this vast span of time, the average rate of deposition must have been extremely slow, yet there is very good evidence that individual beds accumulated rapidly. Aha! So they're saying there's evidence. If you just look at the evidence, you would think that the layers were laid down rapidly. But that won't work for evolution. So we have to come up with plan B. And that is that it took anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000 years to lay down a foot of sedimentary rock. Whereas if you just look at the evidence itself and your thoughts are not colored by evolutionary thought, you would think that it was laid down rapidly. And this was a surprise to those people when the stratigraphers heard people start talking about these layers being laid down over billions of years. It presented a dilemma because they said, well, that doesn't make sense because these obviously were laid down very rapidly. So once again, if you just take the evidence, it leads to a very obvious conclusion. But if you have a doctrine to support, then you have to change what is obviously there. So that is Uniformitarianism. Now let's talk about Catastrophism, or like I said, possibly Catastrophism, but I think it's Catastrophism. At least that's how I pronounce it. Catastrophism. The Bible describes two major worldwide events that shape the geological features of the earth. Okay, when you think of catastrophism, don't only think of the flood. That's one of the major events in history that shape the features of the earth. But the other is creation. Creation and the flood are the two great events that shape the geological features of the earth. Creation in Genesis chapter 1. Let's read some of these verses. Verse 2, darkness was on the face of the deep. Genesis 1 verse 2, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Verse 6, and God made the firmament in the midst of the waters, divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. Verse 9 and 10, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. So that is the description of creation of the earth itself, not the animals and plants, but of the earth itself, and the firmament, that is space. So you see here a description of tremendous upheavals of the earth as the dry land appeared and the seas were gathered together. So God didn't create the earth as we see it today. When he created the earth, in order to bring the land together and put the seas together, he made the dry land appear. Well, when that happened, just imagine the violence, the dirt and the silt that were carried by this violent movement of the water as the dry land appeared and the seas were gathered together. So these dirt and silt particles would be deposited as the waters settled. Deposited, remember when we talk about silt and dirt and particles being deposited by water, that's what created the sedimentary rock. And of course there would be various types of soils and varying speeds of water movement that would cause stratification of the soils. So if you have a large body of water, or a large pool of water, say, a large amount of water, and you put all kinds of soils in it, and you agitated that water violently, well, it would lay down at different rates, and it would lay down in different strata, that is, different layers. But that is borne out by the violence of that water movement. And of course, these strata, the layers, would not contain any fossils. Why is that? Because there were no animals yet. We're still on creation. We're not on the flood yet. We're still just talking about how God created the earth and gathered the dry land together and gathered the seas together. And so these strata would be compacted, and they would be cemented. They would be hardened into rock, sedimentary rock, but no fossils in this rock. So what do we find? We find that is just the case in Precambrian rock. The Precambrian, the so-called Precambrian era or period was sedimentary rock that has no fossils in it. And then remember the Cambrian explosion that happened following that. All right, that is the creation part of catastrophism. All right, let's talk about the flood, which is the part that we see most obviously when we study the rocks and the geologic features. The flood is described in Genesis chapter 7. So let's look at some verses from that chapter. Verse 11. The same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Verse 11. Verse 17. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased. Verse 19. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. Verse 20, 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Verse 21, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth. So in this passage, we see the descriptions that all the mountains were covered by 15 cubits, that is something around 23 feet of water. So the shallowest part under the surface of the water was 23 feet deep, and that is covering the highest mountain, the top of the mountains. Now, I just want to point out, it is all the high hills. The mountains did not exist then like they do now, for reasons we'll talk about in just a moment. We've already hinted at it before, but the mountains were not as tall when the flood waters were unleashed upon the earth as they are now. So what we find, surprisingly to evolutionists, but not to us, is that there are marine fossils, that is, animals that lived in the ocean. Marine fossils are found on the tops of mountains. Here's an article from the New York Times. No conservative publication is that, but this article said whale fossils high in the Andes, that is the Andes Mountains, show how mountains rose from the sea. In the article it says scientists have found fossils of whales and other marine animals in the mountain sediments in the Andes, indicating that the South American mountain chain rose very rapidly from the sea. And apparently they were surprised about that, but we're not surprised because that's just exactly what the Bible says. We talked about this passage recently, Psalm 104, beginning in verse 5. He established the earth upon its foundation. Okay, now he's talking about creation. He established the earth upon its foundation so that it will not totter forever and ever. Then he's talking about the flood. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. In other words, when it was time for the flood to end, God said, waters, it's time to assuage, it's time to flee. So at the rebuke, the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down. Love that wording there in the New American Standard Bible. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you had established for them. Well, that sounds just like that article that said the Andes mountain chain rose very rapidly from the sea. Well, they discovered that in the 1900s, but the Bible said that many hundreds of years before. So it's no surprise to us. This is what is expected from the biblical description. But it's interesting how many things that we predict from biblical accounts is just the way we find it. And what do we say about scientists? Scientists were surprised when they discovered these things, but we were not. So when we're talking about the mountains were covered, where did all that water come from? There's not enough water now, right, to cover all the mountains. Well, like I said, those mountains were not as tall as they are now. Let's talk about the water. Where did it come from? Genesis chapter 1. This is in the account of creation. Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 6. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. Okay, that firmament, if you have the New American Standard Bible, you will see the word expanse. Expanse there just means a big space. So that is the area that we might call space. When it says he called the firmament heaven, he's not talking about the dwelling place of God. He's just talking about the heavens, where not only the birds fly, but also where the atmosphere fades away and goes into outer space. And I don't know exactly what level that goes up to, but listen to this. This is fascinating. He said, let there be a firmament, that is this expanse, in the midst of the waters. And let that firmament divide the waters from the waters. God made this firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament, that is what's on the surface of the earth, from the waters which were above the firmament. So there was water above the expanse or space. And it was so, just as God says. So there was water above the firmament of heaven. That is fascinating. Don't know exactly everything about that, but I know that there was water above the firmament that God created. And that water, I believe, was held back by the windows of heaven. Remember, it said he unleashed or opened the windows of heaven when the flood started. Well, those windows of heaven were holding back those waters that were above the firmament. Well, this water, okay, now I'm about to tell you what my belief is about, just the waters that were above the firmament. Now, I understand that not every Bible believer, not every creation believer, not every believer in the biblical flood believes everything that I'm about to say, but I think it makes a lot of sense. So with that, we'll just move forward and look at these things and see what you think about it. This water that was above the firmament and held back by the windows of heaven before the flood waters were unleashed, before those windows of heaven were opened, that water would have formed a canopy around the earth, just a covering around the entire earth. Some people believe that was a vapor canopy, not just solid water, but it was a mist or a vapor above the firmament. And that water then would have, this canopy would have protected the earth from the sun's radiation. And that would have created, the climate would have been very different than it is today. It would have created a tropical climate all around the earth because it was been protected from the sun's radiation. And we see evidence of a tropical climate around the earth. We see fossils of mammoths. You know what mammoths are? Those are a relative, you might say, of elephants, very closely resembling elephants, but I think even bigger. But those mammoths lived in Siberia and the Arctic, where no animals live today, at least certainly not elephants. But those mammoths were quick frozen. So they're just kind of frozen in position. And not a few of them, but something like 5 million mammoths. And they're not just, I said frozen in position, frozen where they were. And one description said that they are cast about, mangled, and then frozen. Why would they be cast about and mangled before they were frozen? Well, very obviously, they were cast about by something, and I believe that would have been, of course, the flood waters when it took them away and killed them. And then after that, after the flood waters went away, they were quick frozen. But sometimes those mammoths, when we find them today, you can see pictures of them online. Should have added a picture to this study, but that they would be fully intact. Some mammoths are fully intact, with vegetation still in their mouths. That's how quickly frozen they were. You can still, I mean, they lived thousands of years ago, but they still have the vegetation in their mouths from when they were eating, and were quickly killed and frozen. So interesting thing about the waters that were above the firmament and that canopy. Well, there's more evidence that there was a canopy protecting the earth from the sun's radiation. It would also protect us, for that is, those people who lived before the flood, protect the human body. You know, radiation from the sun not only causes the climate as we see it today, but also causes cancer, causes mutations. We talked about mutations. Radiation is a major cause of mutations. Well, the Earth would have been protected from the radiation of the sun by that pre-flood vapor canopy, and aging would have been slowed tremendously because of being protected from that radiation. And we see, of course, after the flood, the lifespan of man declined, and somewhat rapidly. Let's look at some lifespans of men as recorded in the Bible before and after the flood. Of course, you know who was the oldest man who ever lived, as recorded in the Bible? Methuselah, 969 years. Well, let's look at some of these other people. Adam, Seth, and on. Look at that, continuing around 900 years, and then all of a sudden, after the flood, a very rapid fall off, very rapid decline in lifespans. Adam lived 930 years, Methuselah 969 years, Noah lived 950 years. Look at Shem. Shem was on the ark, but after the flood, he only lived to be 600 years old. And then very suddenly after that, Peleg lived to be 239 years old. Nahor lived 148 years. Abraham lived 175 years. And on we go to Moses, who lived 120 years. And then when we get to David, we see that he lived 70 years. And of course, that famous passage in Psalm 90, verse 10, saying that lifespan of man would be 70 years, or if by reason of strength, perhaps 80 years. And that's just a general time frame for the lifespan of man. But that wasn't true before the flood, when men were living to well over 800, 900 years before the flood. So I believe there is a lot of evidence for that pre-flood vapor canopy that protected men from the sun's radiation. All right, so we're still talking about catastrophism, and then we see the flood began. In chapter 7, Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, we see that Earth's crust was broken up when it says the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and then there was extremely heavy rain. Heavy rain like I don't believe we have ever seen anything like it. The windows of heaven were opened, and the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. Today, I heard perhaps the loudest clap of thunder I've ever heard in my life. At least it seemed that way. And it was very, very heavy rain. But then when I think about this, I think about the flood, the rain that I saw today, and the heaviest rain you've ever seen was, I believe, not even close to the rain that fell when the flood, when the windows of heaven were open and the flood waters fell. Let's read this passage in Genesis chapter 7, beginning in verse 11. All the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were open, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. down to verse 17. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, the breath of the Spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. Every man and animal was swept away. Even the birds, we read in that chapter 7, verse 23, birds were grounded and killed. And God had predicted that in chapter 6, verse 7. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air. For I am sorry that I have made them. I think that's another evidence that the rain was heavier than anything we have ever seen. The birds were even grounded by the rainwaters that fell. At least that's the way it seems to me. That God may have had another way of destroying the birds, but that makes sense. With the heavy rain that fell, the birds couldn't even stay not only in the air, but even on the trees. So this is all the animals and man were killed. And Jesus in Matthew 24 described it this way. He says, for as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. I just like the way that's worded. The floodwaters just took them away. Every living thing died who was not on the ark. So the fountains of the great deep were broken up. So when you think of that, think about what that means. There were waters apparently below the surface of the earth, and those fountains were broken up. Fountains of the great deep were broken up, which would have unleashed not only water, but tremendous amounts of silt and soil would be swept away by the violent movement of the water. So we have biblical evidence for the flood, because it is described in some great detail in Genesis chapter 7 to 10, but also other passages in the Bible. So there's biblical evidence for the flood, but there's also a great amount of physical evidence for the flood in sedimentary rock. Remember, sedimentary rock is rock that is laid down in layers, in strata, laid down by water. And we see that some 75% or more of the surface of the earth is covered by sedimentary rock. Sometimes up to 40,000 feet, sometimes up to 7 miles thick. Think about that, 7 miles thick of sedimentary rock. How could that have happened? 7 miles of sediment laid down layer by layer by layer. I think nothing could account for that other than a great worldwide flood. So to look at this, excuse me, okay, sorry about that little glitch. But to look at a picture like this, it kind of gives us a feeling. This is, once again, Grand Canyon. Gives us just a sense of what sedimentary rock looks like and how much of the earth it covers. Look how low it goes, how high it goes. All of that is sedimentary rock laid down by water. Not like this picture, because it gives a little bit of a sense of the vastness of Grand Canyon. You can't even see the tops of those cliffs, those mountains. Look how small those people look on that river. But all that is sedimentary rock laid down by water. And that fits perfectly with the biblical description of the flood. Biblical evidence matches up with the physical evidence. All right, we've talked a little bit about fossilization. This is another evidence of catastrophism, that we think about fossils. Well, most animals die and their remains are just destroyed, and a few years later there's no evidence that that animal was ever there. This fossilization is the hard parts, the bone, shell, and teeth of animals that are protected from decay. That is, they have to be protected somehow in order for fossilization to take place. They have to be protected from scavengers and protected from weather. Well, how can that happen? Well, the best conditions, that is practically the only way that can happen, is to be rapidly buried. And that's what I believe happened in the flood, because as we've talked about, when you think of the flood, don't just think about water. Think about the tremendous amounts of soil and silt, dirt, and rocks that would have been violently thrown about by that water all over the earth, which is what accounts for all the sedimentary rock. So that is what buried all those animals and caused them to be fossilized. So I believe when you look at fossils, you're seeing a snapshot of the earth in Noah's day. Now, according to Uniformitarianism people, they believe creation or evolutionists believe that fossils are just a movie, a long drawn out movie of Earth's history. But I don't think so. I think it's just a click, just a snapshot, a picture of what the Earth looked like in Noah's day. The vast majority of all fossils were animals that were alive when Noah was alive. And they were buried by the floodwaters and the soil and the dirt that was carried by the floodwaters in that sedimentary rock. And they fossilized. And they became just a snapshot of what the earth was like at that time. So when you dig up a fossil, when you see a fossil, just think about that. That animal was alive when Noah was alive and when the earth was covered with water in the flood. It's kind of amazing to think about that, fascinating to think, and even sobering to think that this was true, that this is an animal that was living when Noah was alive. Well, another evidence of that is fossil graveyards. The fossil graveyards are not just in a few places, they exist all over the world. That is, millions of animals that are buried together. They are mangled, they are twisted, and they're buried in a mass grave, you might say, but they are fossilized. So when you dig up one, you're not digging up one fossil, you're digging up hundreds and thousands and millions of fossils in one place. Well, how could that have happened? Obviously, it had to be a violent floodwaters that caused those massive deaths all in one place, and for those animals to be buried so that fossilization could occur. Once again, best and I believe only answered by the flood. And here's something we talked about in a previous lesson, just a little bit: polystrate trees. That is, fossilized trees that extend through so-called millions of years of sedimentary rock strata. One tree, but it extends through millions of years of so-called millions of years of sedimentary rock. This is a big problem for uniformitarians. How could that have possibly happened? Of course, it fits perfectly with catastrophism. Here's a description of those polystrate trees in the book called The New Catastrophism from 1993. Standing trees up to 10 meters high in the Lancashire coalfield of northwest England. Obviously, sedimentation had to be very rapid to bury a tree in a standing position before it rotted and fell down. Standing trees are known at many levels and in many parts of the world. We cannot escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid indeed, and that at other times there were long breaks in the sedimentation, though it looks uniform and continuous. We'll have more to say about that. But it's interesting that they realize that these polystrate trees exist many places around the world, and they cover, they transverse many years, so-called many millions of years of sedimentation. Well, that could not have happened because those trees would have rotted long ago. Here's the picture we looked at before when we thought about polystrate trees. Here's another one. You see the sedimentary rock there. You see the layers, and then you see one tree transversing a bunch of those layers. Here's another one. Sedimentary rock, one tree fossilized or petrified in that sedimentary rock. So just once again, many evidences of the flood, and I believe these things that we've looked at could not have happened any other way, and to believe that they did happen through uniformitarianism, that is slow and gradual processes that never have changed in their rates, I believe is a bit of a stretch. These things are best answered, and as I said, I believe only answered by the flood. Well, with that, we will conclude this study, and then be prepared to study again on Wednesday night. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Hope you've gotten something out of this class and that it's been beneficial to you. God bless you, and hope to see you again next time.